The wind howled through the snow-covered Wyoming mountains like a banshee seeking vengeance, drowning out the labored breathing of Preston Quinn as he urged his exhausted horse through the deepening drifts. The blizzard had struck without warning 3 hours earlier, transforming the crisp December afternoon of 1876 into a white nightmare that threatened to claim both man and beast. Preston pulled his sheepskin coat tighter around his broad shoulders, squinting through the curtain of white. 28 years of life on the frontier had taught him to respect nature's fury, but his stubborn determination had pushed him to continue his journey despite the darkening sky that had promised the coming storm. Now, as the temperature plummeted and visibility shrank to mere feet, he was beginning to regret that decision. "Just a bit further, Thunder," he murmured to the sturdy black gelding beneath him, his gloved hand patting the horse's frost-covered neck. "We'll find shelter soon." The wind momentarily slackened, granting Preston a slightly clearer view of the landscape ahead. His keen blue eyes, shadowed beneath the brim of his snow-dusted Stetson, caught an unexpected shape amid the white expanse, something that didn't belong among the natural contours of snow and rock. Preston guided Thunder toward the anomaly, his heart quickening as the shape resolved itself into a human form nearly buried in the snow. Dismounting swiftly despite his numbed limbs, he trudged through knee-deep drifts until he reached the still figure. "Hello," he called, kneeling beside what he now recognized as a woman. Her face was deathly pale, lips tinged blue, and her dark lashes rested against snow-whitened cheeks. A traveling cloak, woefully inadequate for such weather, was wrapped around her slender frame, and a small leather satchel lay partially buried beside her. Preston removed his glove with his teeth and pressed cold, stiffened fingers to her neck, searching for a pulse. For a terrifying moment he felt nothing, but then there it was, faint, sluggish, but present. She lived, though barely. "Madam, can you hear me?" he asked, gently brushing snow from her face. When she didn't respond, he quickly assessed his options. His own cabin lay miles away across treacherous terrain. The town of Riverspend was closer, perhaps 3 miles through the mountains, but the storm made travel dangerous. Yet he had no choice. The woman would die without immediate care. Without hesitation, Preston gathered her into his arms, surprised at how light she felt despite her sodden clothing. Her head lolled against his chest as he carried her to Thunder, who watched with steam billowing from flared nostrils. "We've got precious cargo now, boy," Preston murmured as he carefully arranged the unconscious woman across the saddle before mounting behind her. He cradled her against his chest with one arm, using the other to gather the reins. "Let's go." Thunder needed no further encouragement. The experienced mountain horse picked his way forward, seemingly understanding the urgency of their mission. Preston kept his body curved protectively around the woman, sharing what warmth he could while scrutinizing the trail ahead. In the frigid silence broken only by the wind and Thunder's labored breathing, Preston found himself speaking to the unconscious woman. "Hold on, miss. I don't know how you ended up out here alone, but I'm getting you to safety." His voice, rough from cold and disuse, sounded strange to his own ears. Living alone for 3 years since returning from the war had left him unaccustomed to conversation. An hour passed with agonizing slowness. The woman hadn't stirred once, and Preston's worry deepened with each passing minute. The cold had penetrated even his sturdy winter gear, and he could only imagine how it must be affecting her less protected body. Periodically, he would check her pulse, relieved each time to find it still present, though growing weaker. "Not much farther now," he assured both his horse and his unconscious companion as a familiar ridge came into view. Beyond it lay Riverspend and, more importantly, Doc Wilson's clinic, As they crested the ridge, Thunder stumbled, nearly sending both riders into the snow. Preston tightened his grip on both the reins and the woman, his heart hammering. "Easy, boy," he soothed, patting the horse's straining neck. "Easy." Thunder regained his footing, but Preston could feel the animal's exhaustion. The horse had been pushing through deep snow for hours, carrying double weight. "Just a little more," Preston encouraged. "You can rest soon." The woman in his arms suddenly shuddered violently, a small moan escaping her blue-tinged lips. It was the first sound she'd made since he'd found her, and while it spoke of pain, it also meant she lived. "That's it," Preston said, relief coloring his voice. "Fight. We're almost there." The lights of Riversbend appeared through the swirling snow like beacons of hope. Preston had never been so grateful to see the small frontier town. As they approached the outskirts, he could make out the shapes of buildings hunched against the storm. The town was quiet, most citizens having the good sense to remain indoors. Preston guided Thunder directly to Doc Wilson's clinic at the far end of the main street. The small building, with its distinctive red door, was thankfully illuminated from within. Preston didn't bother dismounting properly. He slid from the saddle, the woman clutched firmly against his chest and staggered through the snow to the door. He kicked at the solid wood with his boot. "Doc Wilson," he shouted, his voice cracking with strain and cold. "Open up! Emergency!" The door swung open moments later, revealing a balding man with spectacles perched on his nose and suspenders over his rumpled shirt. Dr. Henry Wilson's expression of annoyance quickly transformed to concern as he took in the scene before him. Preston Quinn. "What in God's name?" his gaze fixed on the woman. "Bring her in immediately." Preston shouldered his way inside, the warmth of the clinic hitting him like a physical force after hours in the blizzard. "Found her in the snow," he explained tersely, following the doctor to an examination table in the back room. "Been carrying her for miles. She's barely breathing." "Set her down here," Doc Wilson instructed, clearing the table with one sweep of his arm. "How long has she been exposed?" "Don't know," Preston replied, gently laying the woman on the table. "She was already half buried when I found her, maybe 3 hours ago." The doctor immediately began removing her wet outer garments. "She's in the advanced stages of hypothermia. We need to warm her core temperature gradually." He glanced at Preston. "There's a stack of blankets in that cupboard. Grab them and stoke up that fire." Preston moved quickly, his own discomfort forgotten as he built up the fire in the iron stove and retrieved the blankets. As the doctor worked on the woman, Preston finally had a chance to truly see her for the first time. She was young, perhaps 22 or 23, with delicate features and dark chestnut hair that was now damp with melting snow. Even in her deathly pallor, there was something striking about her face, a strength in the set of her jaw, a refinement to her features that spoke of education and breeding. She wore a simple but well-made traveling dress beneath her cloak, now sodden and ruined by the elements. "Will she live?" Preston asked bluntly as he handed over the blankets. Doc Wilson's expression was grave. "It's too soon to say. Her body temperature is dangerously low, and I'm concerned about the possibility of frostbite in her extremities." He wrapped her in the blankets, leaving only her face exposed. "The next few hours will tell. I need to prepare some heated bricks to place around her." Preston nodded, moving toward the door. "I need to see to my horse. He's exhausted." "The livery's closed, but Simmons won't mind if you use it," Doc Wilson said without looking up from his patient. "Come back when you're done. I could use the help." Outside, the storm continued unabated. Preston led Thunder to the nearby livery stable, where he unsaddled the weary horse and rubbed him down thoroughly before providing fresh hay and water. "You did good, boy," he murmured, stroking the horse's muzzle. "Real good." With thunder settled, Preston returned to the clinic, his own exhaustion beginning to make itself known in the ache of his muscles and the heaviness of his limbs. Inside, he found Doc Wilson applying warm compresses to the woman's hands and feet. "How is she?" Preston asked, removing his hat and coat. "Still alive, which is more than I expected," the doctor replied. "Her breathing is a bit stronger. I've managed to warm her extremities without causing damage. No signs of frostbite, thank the Lord." Preston nodded, moving closer to the table. "Any idea who she is?" "None. There was nothing in her pockets to identify her. We'll have to wait until she wakes up if she wakes up." Doc Wilson gave Preston an appraising look. "You don't look much better than she does. Sit down before you fall down." Preston sank into a chair near the stove, the warmth finally penetrating his chilled body. "I'm fine, just tired." "You're lucky you didn't end up with frostbite yourself," the doctor scolded. "What were you doing out in that blizzard?" "Heading back to my cabin after picking up supplies in Laramie. Storm caught me by surprise." Preston's gaze remained fixed on the woman's still face. "Lucky I came across her when I did." "Lucky indeed," Doc Wilson agreed. "A few more minutes and we wouldn't be having this conversation about whether she'll live or die." The woman suddenly gasped, her body arching slightly before subsiding back onto the table. Both men moved quickly to her side, but her eyes remained closed, though her breathing had definitely strengthened. "That's a good sign," Doc Wilson said. "Her body's fighting back." He checked her pulse again. "Still weak, but steadier." For the next several hours, Preston assisted the doctor in the careful process of warming the woman's body. They placed heated bricks wrapped in cloths around her, changed the warm compresses regularly, and periodically administered small amounts of warm broth between her lips, which she reflexively swallowed even while unconscious. As dawn approached, Preston found himself nodding off in the chair beside her. Doc Wilson had gone to catch a few hours' sleep in his adjacent living quarters, leaving Preston to watch over their patient. The storm outside had finally abated, leaving an eerie silence broken only by the occasional creak of the building settling and the soft, regular breathing of the woman on the table. Preston studied her face in the soft lamplight. Color had returned to her cheeks, and her lips were no longer blue. She was beautiful, he realized with a start, not in the flashy way of the girls at the saloon, but with a natural, unassuming grace that seemed at odds with the frontier. What had brought her alone into the mountains during a Wyoming winter? And where had she been heading? As if sensing his scrutiny, the woman's eyelids fluttered and then opened. For a moment she stared blankly at the ceiling, disoriented. Then her gaze shifted, focusing on Preston with startling intensity. Her eyes were a vivid green, like spring grass after rain. "Where?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Preston leaned forward. "You're safe, madam, in Riverspend. I found you in the snow during the blizzard." Confusion clouded her features. "Blizzard?" "Yes, madam, you were nearly frozen when I came across you. Brought you to Doc Wilson's clinic here in town." Preston kept his voice gentle, aware of how disorienting this must be for her. "Can you tell me your name?" she swallowed with difficulty, and Preston quickly poured a small cup of water from the pitcher beside the table. He helped her take a sip, supporting her head with his hand. "Beatrice," she finally said after drinking. "Beatrice Lawson." "Miss Lawson," Preston acknowledged with a nod. "I'm Preston Quinn. Do you remember what happened, how you came to be out in that storm?" Beatrice's brow furrowed as she struggled to recall. "The stagecoach, we hit something. Wheel broke. The driver said we were only a few miles from town, so I started walking, but then the snow began." She trailed off, distress evident in her expression. "The others, was anyone else?" "You were alone when I found you," Preston said gently. "There's been no word of a stagecoach accident, but communication's been cut off by the storm." Before she could respond, the door to the adjacent room opened, and Doc Wilson appeared, looking refreshed after his brief rest. "Ah, our patient is awake," he said with evident satisfaction, approaching the table. "That's excellent news." "This is Doc Wilson," Preston explained to Beatrice. "He's been caring for you through the night." "Thank you, Doctor," Beatrice said weakly. "And thank you, Mr. Quinn. I understand you saved my life." Preston shifted uncomfortably. "Just did what anyone would do." Doc Wilson snorted as he checked Beatrice's pulse. "Rode miles through a blizzard with you across his saddle, Miss Lawson. Not many would risk that, I can tell you." Beatrice's gaze returned to Preston, something new in her eyes, a mix of gratitude and wonder. "Then I owe you more than thanks." "You don't owe me anything," Preston replied gruffly, standing. "Doc, I should check on Thunder and then head back to my place if the trail's passable." "In this much snow, not likely," the doctor said, shaking his head. "Besides, we need to organize a search party for that stagecoach. If there were others, they might still be out there." Responsibility settled on Preston's shoulders like a familiar weight. "I'll talk to Sheriff Daniels. We'll get men together." "Mr. Quinn," Beatrice called as he reached for his coat, "please be careful. I wouldn't want my rescue to result in others risking themselves." The genuine concern in her voice gave Preston pause. He turned back to find her struggling to sit up despite Doc Wilson's protestations. "Miss Lawson, you need to rest," the doctor insisted. "But the driver, Mr. Parks, and there was a family with a child," Beatrice argued weakly. "I can't just lie here while they might be in danger." Preston found himself moving back to her side. "You won't be helping them by collapsing, Miss Lawson. Let Doc Wilson take care of you. I'll make sure we find the stagecoach." Their eyes met again, and something unspoken passed between them, an understanding, a connection forged in crisis. Beatrice slowly nodded and allowed the doctor to ease her back down. "Mr. Quinn is right," Doc Wilson said firmly. "Your body has suffered a severe shock. You need at least a day of complete rest." "I'll come back with news," Preston promised, surprising himself with the offer. Typically, once his duty was done, he retreated to his solitary existence. Something about Beatrice Lawson, however, made him reluctant to simply disappear. Outside, Riverspend was transformed. The blizzard had left behind nearly 3 feet of pristine snow that glittered in the morning sunlight. The town was beginning to stir, smoke rising from chimneys as residents emerged to assess the damage and clear paths. Preston made his way to the sheriff's office, where he found Sheriff Tom Daniels already organizing men. "Quinn," the sheriff called when Preston entered. "Heard you brought in a half-frozen woman last night, one of the stagecoach passengers," Preston nodded. "She's conscious now. Says the coach hit something and broke a wheel a few miles out. She tried to walk to town but got caught in the storm." "Damn," Daniels muttered. The Carson family was on that coach, including their 6-year-old daughter, and old Mrs. Miller was heading to her sister's place. He turned to the assembled men. "We need to find that coach immediately. Get your warmest gear and meet back here in 15 minutes." Preston joined the search party of 10 men that rode out of Riverspend an hour later. They followed the main road toward Laramie, the only route the stagecoach would have taken. The going was slow, their horses struggling through deep snow drifts. After nearly 2 hours of careful progress, they spotted the stagecoach tilted at an awkward angle against a stand of pines. As they approached, Preston saw no movement, no smoke from a fire, nothing to indicate survivors. "Hello, the coach," Sheriff Daniels called as they neared. "Anyone there?" The door of the coach creaked open, and a haggard face appeared a man in his 40s with a week's worth of beard and exhausted eyes. "Thank God," he croaked. "We thought we'd been forgotten." The search party quickly dismounted and rushed to the coach. Inside were 5 people. The driver, Mr. Parks, with a broken leg, the Carson family husband, wife, and their young daughter Emma, and elderly Mrs. Miller. All were alive but suffering from cold, hunger, and in Mrs. Miller's case, a dangerous cough. "We tried to keep the cold out," Mr. Carson explained as the men distributed blankets and the food they'd brought. "Blocked the broken window with luggage, huddled together for warmth. Would have frozen for sure if Parks hadn't managed to start a small fire last night, but we ran out of wood." "What about Miss Lawson?" Mrs. Carson asked anxiously. "She insisted on trying to reach town for help. We told her it was too dangerous, but she wouldn't listen." "She made it," Preston assured them. "Nearly didn't, but she's recovering at Doc Wilson's clinic." Relief washed over their faces. "Brave young woman," Mr. Parks said through gritted teeth, his splinted leg clearly causing him pain. "Gave me her extra blanket before she left, even knowing she'd be facing that storm." The men worked quickly to prepare the survivors for transport back to Riverspend. They constructed a makeshift sledge for Mr. Parks and ensured everyone was bundled as warmly as possible before beginning the journey home. When they arrived in town several hours later, Preston helped deliver the survivors to Doc Wilson's clinic, which was quickly becoming overcrowded. The doctor immediately began treating the most serious cases, Parks' broken leg and Mrs. Miller's worrying cough. Preston found Beatrice sitting up in a chair by the fire, wrapped in blankets but looking remarkably improved. Her face lit up when she saw him enter. "You found them. Are they all right?" she asked eagerly. Preston nodded, removing his snow-covered hat. "All alive, thanks in no small part to you, Miss Lawson. They said you gave up your blanket before setting out." A flush colored her cheeks. "I was wearing my cloak. Mr. Parks needed it more with his leg." She looked past Preston anxiously. "Emma, the little girl, cold and frightened but otherwise fine," Preston assured her. "Her parents, too." Relief softened Beatrice's features. "Thank goodness, and Mrs. Miller's cough, Doc's treating her now. He seems concerned but didn't say it was hopeless." Beatrice sank back in her chair, visibly relieved. "I feared I'd failed them when I couldn't reach town, if you hadn't found me." "But I did," Preston said simply. No sense dwelling on what might have been. Their conversation was interrupted by Mrs. Carson, who rushed over to embrace Beatrice with tears streaming down her face. "You brave, foolish girl," she said, holding Beatrice tightly. "We've been so worried." Preston stepped back, allowing the reunion to unfold without his awkward presence. He caught Doc Wilson's eye across the room, and the doctor nodded toward the door, indicating they should speak outside. In the relative quiet of the porch, Doc Wilson lit his pipe and regarded Preston thoughtfully. "That young woman's got more courage than sense, heading out in a blizzard like that." "She was trying to save lives," Preston pointed out. "Indeed." The doctor puffed contemplatively. "I've been speaking with her while you were gone. Interesting story. She's come from Boston to take a teaching position at the new school in Riverspend. Apparently, her letters of introduction and credentials were in her satchel." Preston remembered the leather bag he'd seen partially buried beside her in the snow. In the urgency of the rescue, he'd left it behind. "I'll go back for her belongings once things settle," he offered. Doc Wilson nodded, then added casually, "She's a widow. Husband died in the war, one of the last battles. No children." Preston gave the doctor a sharp look. "Why are you telling me this?" A smile quirked beneath the doctor's mustache. "Just thought you might be interested, considering how you've hardly taken your eyes off her since you brought her in." Heat rose to Preston's face, and he was grateful for the cold air that could explain away his reddened cheeks. "I was concerned for her welfare, nothing more." "Of course," Doc Wilson agreed too readily. "Just as you've been concerned for the welfare of every stray dog and injured traveler that's crossed your path since you came back from the war. Only difference is you don't usually sit up all night watching over them." Preston frowned. "Are you suggesting—" "I'm not suggesting anything," the doctor interrupted, his expression growing more serious. "But I know isolation when I see it, Preston. You've been hiding away in that cabin for 3 years, barely speaking to anyone unless absolutely necessary." He tapped his pipe against the porch railing. "It wouldn't hurt you to remember there's more to life than surviving." Before Preston could formulate a response, the clinic door opened, and Beatrice herself appeared, wrapped in a borrowed shawl. "Oh, I'm sorry to interrupt," she said, clearly surprised to find the men on the porch. "Mrs. Simmons said I could get some fresh air as long as I didn't stay out too long." "A fine idea," Doc Wilson said cheerfully. "Preston here was just volunteering to retrieve your satchel from where it was left in the snow." Beatrice's eyes widened. "Oh, Mr. Quinn, you've done so much already. I couldn't ask that of you." "It's no trouble," Preston said, grateful for an excuse to escape the doctor's knowing gaze. "I need to check the trail conditions anyway before heading back to my place." "Your place?" Beatrice asked, a small frown creasing her brow. "You don't live in town?" "Preston has a cabin about 10 miles into the mountains," Doc Wilson explained. "Likes his privacy, our Mr. Quinn does." Beatrice studied Preston with new interest. "That sounds peaceful." Something in her tone made Preston look at her more closely. There was a wistfulness there, an understanding that caught him off guard. Before he could respond, Sheriff Daniels approached, stomping snow from his boots. "Miss Lawson," the sheriff said, tipping his hat. "Glad to see you recovering. I've spoken with Mayor Thompson, and he's arranged for you to stay with the Wilsons until you're fully recovered and the schoolhouse living quarters are ready." "That's very kind," Beatrice replied. "When will the school term begin? I know I'm arriving earlier than planned." "Not until after the new year, so you've got a couple weeks to settle in," Daniels assured her. "Town's real excited about having a proper schoolteacher at last." Preston watched the exchange silently, struck by how quickly Beatrice had become a part of Riverspin's community. There was an ease to her interactions, a genuine warmth that drew people in despite her recent ordeal. "Well, I should be going if I want to find that satchel before dark," Preston said, preparing to leave. "I'll walk with you to the livery," Doc Wilson offered, following Preston down the steps. As they trudged through the snow-cleared path, the doctor spoke quietly. "She'll need time to recover fully. Hypothermia takes a toll on the body that isn't immediately apparent." "She seems strong," Preston observed. "Strong in spirit, yes, but physically?" The doctor shook his head. "She's putting on a brave face, but I've seen how she winces when she thinks no one's looking. There may be damage to her extremities that won't be evident for days." Preston frowned. "You said there was no frostbite." "No visible frostbite, no, but circulation problems can manifest later. She'll need careful monitoring." Doc Wilson fixed Preston with a significant look. "Someone should check on her regularly." Preston understood the implication immediately. "You've got plenty of people in town who can look in on her. She doesn't need a mountain hermit hovering about." "Perhaps not," the doctor conceded. "But you found her, Preston. There's a connection there whether you acknowledge it or not." At the livery, Preston saddled Thunder, who had recovered well from the previous day's exertions. As he prepared to leave, he glanced back toward the clinic and was surprised to see Beatrice standing on the porch, watching him. She raised a hand in farewell, and after a moment's hesitation, Preston returned the gesture. The ride to where he'd found Beatrice took longer than expected, as fresh snow had obscured many landmarks. Eventually, Preston located the spot by recognizing a distinctive stand of pines nearby. The satchel was completely buried, and he had to dig through nearly 2 feet of snow to retrieve it. The leather bag was stiff with ice, its contents surely ruined by moisture, but Preston secured it to his saddle nonetheless. As he prepared to return to town, he noticed something glinting in the snow nearby. Dismounting, he discovered a small silver locket partially exposed by his digging. It must have fallen from Beatrice's neck during her collapse or his rescue. Preston carefully pocketed the locket, then surveyed the area once more. The isolation that had once seemed so comforting now felt oppressive. His cabin, though only a few miles away, suddenly held little appeal. With a sigh, he turned thunderback toward Riverspend. It was nearly dusk when he arrived in town. Lights glowed warmly from windows, and smoke curled from chimneys against the darkening sky. Preston headed directly to the Wilson home, a modest 2-story house behind the clinic. Mrs. Wilson, a plump, cheerful woman with graying hair, answered his knock. "Preston Quinn, come in out of the cold. You're just in time for supper." "I just came to return Miss Lawson's belongings," Preston explained, remaining on the porch. "Nonsense. You'll come in and warm up at the very least," Mrs. Wilson insisted, practically pulling him inside. "Beatrice will be so pleased. She's been asking about you." Preston found himself ushered into a cozy sitting room where Beatrice sat in an armchair near the fire, a quilt draped across her lap. She looked up as he entered, her face brightening. "Mr. Quinn, you found my satchel," she exclaimed, starting to rise. "Please don't get up," Preston said quickly, moving forward to hand her the recovered items. "It was right where I found you, and this was nearby. I think it might be yours." He pulled out the silver locket. Beatrice gasped, her hand flying to her throat where Preston now noticed a chain would have rested. "My mother's locket. I thought it was lost forever." She took it reverently, clutching it to her chest. "Thank you. This means more to me than you can know." Mrs. Wilson beamed at them both. "Now you simply must stay for supper, Preston. I've made venison stew and fresh bread." Before Preston could decline, Beatrice added her own entreaty. "Please do stay, Mr. Quinn. I've hardly had the chance to properly thank you for saving my life." Put that way, refusal seemed impossible. Preston reluctantly agreed, removing his coat and hat. As Mrs. Wilson bustled off to the kitchen, he found himself alone with Beatrice for the first time since their brief conversation at the clinic. "How are you feeling?" he asked, taking a seat across from her. "Much improved, though Mrs. Wilson insists I stay by the fire as much as possible." Beatrice smiled, examining her recovered satchel. "The papers inside are likely ruined, but I can write to Boston for replacements if necessary." "Doc Wilson mentioned you're to be the new schoolteacher," Preston said. Beatrice nodded, her expression brightening. "Yes, it's a wonderful opportunity. After my husband died, I needed a fresh start, somewhere far from the memories." She looked down at her hands, now clutching the locket. "Do you have family in Riverspend, Mr. Quinn?" "No," Preston replied. "No family anywhere, really. Parents died years ago, no siblings." "That must be lonely," she observed softly. Preston shrugged. "I'm used to it." "Being used to loneliness doesn't make it any less lonely," Beatrice said with surprising insight. Their eyes met, and Preston felt an unexpected connection, a recognition of similar wounds carried beneath different scars. The moment was broken by Mrs. Wilson's announcement of supper. Dr. Wilson joined them, and conversation flowed more easily around the table as they discussed the town, the weather, and plans for the upcoming Christmas celebrations. "The whole town gathers at the church on Christmas Eve," Mrs. Wilson explained to Beatrice. Then there's a community dinner at the town hall. Everyone brings something to share. It sounds wonderful, Beatrice said. Will you attend, Mr. Quinn? Put on the spot, Preston hesitated. I don't usually come to town for the holidays. What a shame, Mrs. Wilson commented. This year would be perfect to change that tradition. After supper, Preston knew he should leave, but found himself lingering. Doc Wilson had been called to check on Mrs. Miller, whose cough had worsened, and Mrs. Wilson was busy in the kitchen. Once again, Preston found himself alone with Beatrice in the sitting room. May I ask you something, Mr. Quinn? Beatrice said after a comfortable silence. Preston, he corrected her. And yes, you may. Preston, she acknowledged with a small smile. Why do you live so far from town? Dr. Wilson mentioned you've been here only 3 years. Preston stared into the fire, considering his answer. After the war, I found it difficult to be around people. Too much noise, too many expectations. He glanced at her. The mountains are honest. They don't pretend to be anything other than what they are. Unlike people, Beatrice supplied. Unlike people, he agreed. I understand more than you might think, she said quietly. After Charles, my husband, died, Boston became unbearable. Everyone with their sympathy and their judgment, watching to see how the young widow would behave. Bitterness tinged her words, as if grief should follow a prescribed path. Preston nodded, recognizing the sentiment. That's why you came west, to escape the watchers. Partly, she admitted. But also to find something meaningful. Charles and I had planned to start a family, but then the war. She trailed off, then rallied. Teaching gives me purpose. Children need education, especially out here. Riversbend is fortunate to have you, Preston said sincerely. Beatrice studied him with those remarkable green eyes. And what gives you purpose, Preston Quinn? The question caught him off guard. Survival, mostly, he answered honestly. Is that enough? Before he could formulate an answer, Mrs. Wilson returned, effectively ending their private conversation. Shortly thereafter, Preston took his leave, promising somewhat reluctantly to return the following day to check on Beatrice's progress. As he rode back to his cabin through the cold, clear night, Preston found himself replaying their conversations. Beatrice Lawson intrigued him in a way no one had for years. Her question echoed in his mind. Is survival enough? For 3 years he'd believed it was. Now he wasn't so certain. The next 2 weeks passed in a pattern Preston had never anticipated. Each day, he found reason to ride into Riversbend ostensibly to check on Thunder's shoe that the blacksmith was repairing, or to purchase supplies he suddenly needed, or to help with the town's recovery efforts after the blizzard. Each visit somehow included time spent with Beatrice. Her recovery progressed steadily. Within days, she was walking around town, meeting the families whose children would be her future pupils. Preston often found himself accompanying her on these visits, surprised by how comfortable he felt in her presence. The Carson girl has a quick mind, he commented as they left the family's home one afternoon. Emma figured out that puzzle box faster than most adults would. Beatrice smiled. You notice that too? She'll do well with advanced reading, I think. They walked slowly through the main street, now cleared of snow but still lined with high banks on either side. Townspeople greeted them warmly, and Preston realized with a start that he'd spoken to more people in the past 2 weeks than in the previous 6 months combined. You're good with them, Beatrice observed. The children, I mean. They respond to you. Preston shrugged, uncomfortable with the observation. Kids are straightforward. They say what they mean. Unlike adults, Beatrice agreed with a knowing smile. The schoolhouse is nearly ready. Mayor Thompson showed me the living quarters yesterday, small but perfectly adequate for one person. When will you move in? Preston asked, ignoring the unexpected pang the question caused. "After Christmas. The Wilsons have insisted I stay through the holiday." She glanced at him sideways. "Have you reconsidered attending the Christmas Eve gathering?" Preston hesitated. The thought of the crowded church, the noise and merriment of the town's celebration, still made him uneasy. Yet the idea of returning alone to his cabin while knowing Beatrice was among the festive townspeople seemed equally unappealing. "I'm not much for crowds," he said finally. Beatrice stopped walking and turned to face him directly. "I would very much like you to be there, Preston," she said simply. The straightforward statement, delivered without artifice or manipulation, struck him powerfully. "Then I'll come," he heard himself say. The smile that illuminated her face was worth any discomfort the gathering might cause him. As Christmas approached, Preston found himself spending more time in town than at his cabin. He helped repair the damaged stagecoach, assisted with preparations for the holiday celebration, and even agreed to play Santa Claus for the town's children, a role he accepted solely because of Beatrice's persuasive abilities. "You're the perfect build," she had insisted. "Tall and broad-shouldered. We'll pad you out a bit, add the beard and hat, and the children will be thrilled." "I don't exactly radiate jolly Christmas spirit," Preston had protested. "You radiate more than you realize," Beatrice had responded with a mysterious smile that left him puzzled but strangely warmed. On the morning of Christmas Eve, Preston arrived in town early, bringing with him a small pine tree strapped to Thunder's saddle, a surprise for Beatrice's new schoolhouse. He had risen before dawn to find and cut the perfect specimen, one that would fit in the corner of the classroom where she planned to gather the children for reading time. When he presented it to her at the schoolhouse, where she was arranging her few teaching materials, her delight was palpable. "It's perfect," she exclaimed, circling the tree with childlike enthusiasm. "How did you know I wanted a tree for the classroom?" "You mentioned it last week," Preston said, pleased by her reaction. "Said the children would enjoy decorating it when school begins." Beatrice looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite interpret. "You listened," she said softly, as if this simple act of attention was somehow remarkable. "Of course I listened," Preston replied, confused by her reaction. "Why wouldn't I?" Instead of answering, Beatrice impulsively rose on tiptoe and kissed his cheek. "Thank you, Preston. It's a wonderful gift." The unexpected gesture left Preston momentarily speechless, his cheek tingling where her lips had touched. Before he could respond, Mayor Thompson entered the schoolhouse, breaking the moment. "Ah, Miss Lawson, and Quinn too. Perfect timing. We need some help with the decorations at the church if you're available." The rest of the day passed in a flurry of activity. Preston found himself drawn into the community preparations, hanging garlands, moving benches, and assisting with whatever tasks needed doing. Throughout it all, he was constantly aware of Beatrice moving through the same spaces, her laughter and voice a beacon he unconsciously oriented himself toward. By evening, Preston had returned to his cabin only long enough to clean up and change into his best clothes, a seldom-worn suit that felt stiff and unfamiliar after years of practical frontier wear. As he rode toward the glow of Riverspin's lights, snowflakes began to fall gently, as if nature itself was decorating for the holiday. The church was transformed when Preston arrived. Candles illuminated every window, pine boughs and red ribbons adorned the walls, and a large tree stood beside the altar, decorated with homemade ornaments and small candles. Nearly the entire town had gathered, the pews filled with families dressed in their finest attire. Preston hesitated at the entrance, suddenly overwhelmed by the crowd and the noise. For a moment, he considered turning back, retreating to the familiar solitude of his mountain home. Then he saw Beatrice standing near the front, scanning the crowd. Their eyes met across the room and her face lit up. She waved, gesturing for him to join her, and Preston found his feet moving forward of their own accord. "You came," she said as he reached her side, her voice warm with approval. "I was beginning to worry." "I said I would," Preston replied simply, suddenly glad he'd made the effort. The Christmas Eve service was unlike anything Preston had experienced in years. The community sang carols together. Children performed a simple nativity pageant, and Reverend Holloway delivered a sermon about hope and new beginnings that seemed to speak directly to Preston's situation. After the service, everyone moved to the town hall for the community dinner. Tables groaned under the weight of dishes brought by each family: roasted meats, vegetables preserved from summer harvests, pies, cakes, and cookies in abundance. Preston found himself seated between Beatrice and Doc Wilson, drawn into conversations he would have avoided only weeks earlier. "You've become quite the social butterfly, Quinn," Sheriff Daniels commented good-naturedly from across the table. "Hardly recognize you without that scowl you usually wear." Preston felt his face warm, but before he could respond, Beatrice interjected smoothly. "Mr. Quinn has been invaluable in helping me learn about the community. I couldn't have asked for a better guide to Riverspend." Her defense, delivered with such natural grace, left Preston feeling both grateful and strangely proud. Throughout the evening, he noticed how seamlessly Beatrice had integrated into the town's fabric. She remembered everyone's names, asked after their concerns, and connected with each person individually. Yet despite her popularity, she continually returned to Preston's side, including him in conversations and drawing him out of his habitual reserve. After dinner came dancing. Musicians from town set up in the corner, playing lively tunes on fiddle, guitar, and harmonica. Couples filled the cleared space, twirling and laughing as children darted between them. "You dance, Preston?" Beatrice asked as they watched from the sidelines. "Not for a very long time," he admitted. "Probably forgotten how." "I doubt that," she said with a smile. "Some things the body remembers even when the mind forgets." When the musicians struck up a waltz, Beatrice looked at him expectantly. Preston hesitated only briefly before offering his hand. "Would you do me the honor, Miss Lawson?" Her hand slipped into his, warm and trusting. "I'd be delighted, Mr. Quinn." Leading her onto the dance floor, Preston was acutely aware of the eyes following them. He positioned his hand respectfully at her waist, took her other hand in his, and began to move to the music. To his surprise, the steps came back naturally, as if the years of isolation had never happened. Beatrice followed his lead perfectly, her green eyes never leaving his face. "See, your body remembered," she said softly. As they moved together through the waltz, something shifted between them, an acknowledgement of the connection that had been building since that snowbound day when he'd found her half frozen in the mountains. Preston realized with sudden clarity that he had been drawn back to life not just by Beatrice's beauty or her kindness, but by her understanding of the isolation he had chosen and her gentle challenge to move beyond it. When the dance ended, Preston reluctantly released her, but Beatrice kept hold of his hand. "I have something for you," she said. "A Christmas gift. Would you walk me back to the Wilsons' house so I can give it to you?" Outside, the snow continued to fall softly, coating the town in fresh white. Lanterns along the street cast golden pools of light, and the sounds of celebration faded behind them as they walked. Preston was intensely aware of Beatrice's hand still in his, of her presence beside him in the quiet night. At the Wilsons' porch, Beatrice asked him to wait while she went inside. She returned moments later with a package wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. "It's not much," she said, suddenly seeming nervous as she handed it to him. "But I wanted you to have something to thank you properly." Preston carefully unwrapped the package to reveal a handsome leather-bound journal and a fountain pen. "Open the cover," Beatrice urged softly. Inside, she had written in elegant script, "For Preston Quinn, who saved more than just a life in the snow. May you find words for the stories only you can tell. With deepest gratitude, Beatrice." Preston stared at the inscription, deeply moved by both the gift and the sentiment behind it. "I don't know what to say," he admitted. "You don't need to say anything," Beatrice assured him. "But perhaps someday you'll write it instead." She hesitated, then added, "Dr. Wilson mentioned you were a teacher before the war, that you have a way with words." Preston looked up in surprise. "He told you that, he thought I should know," she said simply. "One teacher to another." Preston had almost forgotten that part of himself, the young man who had taught literature at a small school in Pennsylvania before the conflict that changed everything. That man had believed in the power of stories, in their ability to connect people across time and circumstance. Somewhere in the mountains, in the struggle simply to survive, he had lost that belief. "Thank you," he said finally, the words inadequate to express what he felt. "I have something for you too, but it's not wrapped." Preston reached into his pocket and withdrew a small wooden carving, a miniature schoolhouse he had spent evenings crafting by the light of his cabin fire. The tiny building had detailed windows, a bell tower, and even a diminutive flagpole. Beatrice gasped in delight as he placed it in her palm. "You made this," Preston nodded. "Thought you might like something to remind you of your new beginning, even when school's not in session." "It's beautiful," she whispered, turning the carving to examine every detail. "I'll treasure it always." They stood in silence for a moment, snowflakes gathering on their shoulders and hair, the sounds of the town's celebration a distant murmur. In that peaceful moment, Preston made a decision that had been forming gradually over the past 2 weeks. "Beatrice," he said, his voice low, "I've been thinking about what you asked me that first evening about whether survival is enough." She looked up at him, her expression open and attentive. "It's not," Preston continued. "Not anymore." He took a deep breath. "I'd like to call on you properly if you'd allow it. Once you're settled in the schoolhouse." The smile that illuminated Beatrice's face outshone every Christmas light in Riversbend. "I'd like that very much, Preston." Emboldened by her response, Preston stepped closer. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to withdraw, he leaned down and kissed her, a gentle, questioning touch that held the promise of more to come. Her lips were warm beneath his, her response sweetly certain as her hand came up to rest against his chest. When they parted, Preston saw in Beatrice's eyes the same wonder he felt, the recognition of something precious and unexpected found in the most unlikely circumstances. "Merry Christmas, Preston," she whispered. "Merry Christmas, Beatrice," he replied, knowing with absolute certainty that his life had irrevocably changed the moment he'd spotted her half-buried form in the snow. The new year brought changes to both Riversbend and Preston Quinn's life. Beatrice began teaching at the schoolhouse, quickly becoming beloved by her students and their parents alike. Her innovative methods and genuine care for each child's progress earned her respect throughout the community. True to his word, Preston began calling on her regularly. At first, their courtship raised eyebrows among some of the more gossipy townspeople. The reclusive mountain man and the refined Boston schoolteacher made an unexpected pair. But as winter melted into spring, their attachment grew visibly stronger, and even the most skeptical observers had to admit they seemed perfectly matched despite their differences. Preston found himself drawn back into community life through Beatrice. He began offering occasional lessons at the school, sharing his knowledge of the local wilderness, teaching the children to identify plants and animal tracks. To his surprise, he rediscovered his love of teaching, of seeing understanding dawn in young minds. In the evenings, he wrote in the journal Beatrice had given him, filling pages with observations, memories, and increasingly, plans for the future. The solitude of his cabin, once his refuge, now felt empty without her presence. He began spending more nights in town than in the mountains, renting a room above the general store until he could decide on a more permanent arrangement. One evening in early April, as they walked along the riverbank after supper at the Wilsons', Preston took Beatrice's hand and stopped beneath a flowering cottonwood tree. "I've been thinking," he began, uncharacteristically nervous. Beatrice smiled up at him, her hair catching the last golden rays of sunset. "A dangerous pastime," she teased. "Indeed," Preston agreed with a smile of his own. "Especially when those thoughts are about building a house." Her expression shifted to one of curiosity. "A house?" "On my land," Preston clarified. "I own a good parcel, not just where my cabin sits, but a beautiful spot overlooking the valley. There's a natural clearing that would be perfect for a proper home." He took both her hands in his. "A home that might suit a schoolteacher and perhaps, someday, a family." Understanding dawned in Beatrice's eyes, her lips parting in surprise. "What I'm trying to say, not very eloquently," Preston continued, "is that I love you, Beatrice Lawson. I think I began falling in love with you that day in the snow, and every day since has only deepened those feelings." He released one of her hands to reach into his pocket, withdrawing a simple gold ring with a small pearl. "Would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" Tears filled Beatrice's eyes, but her smile was radiant. "Yes," she whispered, then more firmly, "Yes, Preston Quinn. I would be proud to be your wife." As he slipped the ring onto her finger, Preston felt a completeness he had never expected to find again after the war. Beatrice rose on tiptoe to kiss him, her arms wrapping around his neck as his encircled her waist, lifting her slightly off the ground in his enthusiasm. When they finally parted, breathless and laughing, Beatrice rested her forehead against his. "When I left Boston, I never imagined finding love again, especially not in the wilderness of Wyoming. And I never imagined finding anyone who could draw me out of my isolation," Preston admitted. "You saved me as surely as I saved you that day in the snow." The news of their engagement spread quickly through River Spend. The town embraced the romance of their story, the schoolteacher who had nearly frozen to death, and the reclusive mountain man who had carried her miles through a blizzard to safety, only to find his own salvation in her love. They were married on a perfect June day in the town's small church, which was filled to overflowing with well-wishers. Beatrice wore a gown of cream-colored silk that Mrs. Wilson had helped her alter from one ordered from a catalog, and carried wildflowers Preston had gathered from the mountains that morning. Preston, nearly unrecognizable in a new suit and freshly trimmed hair, couldn't take his eyes off his bride as she walked toward him on Sheriff Daniel's arm. Doc Wilson stood as Preston's best man, occasionally dabbing at suspicious moisture in his eyes as the couple exchanged vows they had written themselves. "I found you half frozen in the snow," Preston said, his deep voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes. "And in saving your life, discovered my own had been merely existence until that moment. I promise to cherish every day of the life we build together, to protect and support you, to listen and grow with you, and to love you with all that I am for all of our days." Beatrice's voice trembled slightly as she responded. "I journeyed west, seeking a new beginning, never dreaming that beginning would include the greatest love I could imagine." You carried me until I could breathe again, not just that day in the snow, but every day since, as you've shown me that life holds second chances for those brave enough to reach for them. I promise to stand beside you in all things, to create a home filled with warmth and joy, to honor your strength and gentle heart, and to love you completely and faithfully for as long as we both shall live. There wasn't a dry eye in the church as Reverend Holloway pronounced them husband and wife. Preston's kiss to his new bride was both tender and possessive, a promise of the life they would build together. The celebration afterward lasted well into the night, with dancing, feasting, and toasts to the couple's future happiness. As darkness fell, Preston and Beatrice slipped away to begin their honeymoon a week at Preston's cabin, before they would return to start building their new home. That night, as they lay together beneath a quilt in the cabin that had once symbolized Preston's isolation, Beatrice traced the lines of his face with gentle fingers. "You remember what you said when you proposed, about thinking you began falling in love with me that day in the snow?" Preston nodded, capturing her hand and pressing a kiss to her palm. "I did say thinking because I wasn't entirely sure when it happened. Why do you ask?" Beatrice smiled, her eyes reflecting the moonlight streaming through the window. "Because I know exactly when I fell in love with you." "When was that?" Preston asked, intrigued. "I wasn't fully unconscious when you found me," Beatrice confessed. "I was drifting in and out, aware sometimes but unable to respond. I remember being lifted, feeling your heart beat against my cheek as you carried me." Her voice softened. "And I remember you talking to me, telling me to hold on, promising you wouldn't let me die alone in the snow." Preston was surprised. "You never mentioned that before." "Because it seemed like a dream at first," she explained. "But then, when I woke up in Doc Wilson's clinic and saw your face, I recognized your voice." She smiled. "You spoke to me for hours as you carried me through that blizzard, a stranger you had no obligation to save. That's when I fell in love with you before I even knew your name." Deeply moved, Preston gathered her closer. "Then I'm grateful I talk to myself when I'm nervous," he murmured against her hair. Beatrice laughed softly. "So am I, husband, so am I." Over the summer and fall, they built their new home with the help of friends from town. It took shape on the ridge. Preston had chosen a sturdy two-story house with large windows facing the valley and mountains beyond. They designed it with the future in mind. A spacious kitchen, a cozy parlor with bookshelves from floor to ceiling, and several bedrooms for the family they hoped to have. Beatrice continued teaching, riding to and from town each day on a gentle mare Preston had trained specifically for her. Preston himself found a new purpose, using his knowledge of the wilderness to guide travelers and hunters safely through the mountains. His reputation for reliability and expertise spread, bringing steady work that allowed him to be home most evenings with his wife. In the winter, when heavy snows sometimes made daily travel to town impossible, Preston built a smaller cabin near the schoolhouse where they could stay when necessary. The arrangement worked perfectly, giving them both independence and security as the seasons changed. By their first anniversary, their home was complete and fully furnished, a blend of Preston's practical craftsmanship and Beatrice's more refined tastes. They celebrated with a small gathering of their closest friends, including Doc and Mrs. Wilson, Sheriff Daniels and his wife, and the Carson family, whose daughter Emma had become Beatrice's star pupil. As the guests departed and twilight settled over the mountains, Preston and Beatrice stood on their porch, his arm around her shoulders as they watched the first stars appear. "Happy?" Preston asked, though he already knew the answer from the contentment in her expression. "Completely," Beatrice affirmed, leaning into him. After a moment, she added with studied casualness, "Though I've been thinking our home might benefit from one more addition." Preston raised an eyebrow. "Oh, what did you have in mind? A larger barn, more bookshelves?" Beatrice turned in his arms to face him, a mysterious smile playing about her lips. "Actually, I was thinking of a cradle." For a moment, Preston didn't comprehend her meaning. Then understanding dawned and his eyes widened. "Are you saying—" "Yes," Beatrice confirmed, her smile widening at his reaction. "Come spring, there will be 3 of us living in this house." Joy surged through Preston, so powerful it momentarily robbed him of speech. He lifted Beatrice off her feet, spinning her in a circle as laughter bubbled from both of them. "When did you know?" he asked when he finally set her down. "I've suspected for a few weeks, but Doc Wilson confirmed it yesterday," she admitted. "I wanted to be sure before I told you." Preston placed his hand reverently on her still flat stomach, overwhelmed by the miracle of new life growing within the woman he loved. "A baby," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Our baby." "Our family," Beatrice corrected gently, covering his hand with hers. "The one we both thought we'd never have." As they stood together on the porch of the home they had built, watching night settle over the mountains that had once been Preston's solitary refuge, both were struck by how completely their lives had been transformed by a chance encounter in a blizzard. "It's strange to think," Preston mused, "that if I'd taken shelter when the storm first hit instead of pushing forward, I never would have found you. Or if I'd stayed with the stagecoach instead of trying to reach town," Beatrice added. "I'm grateful for our stubbornness," Preston said with a smile. "It brought us together." Beatrice reached up to touch his face, her green eyes reflecting the starlight. "You found me half frozen in the snow and carried me until I breathed again," she said softly, echoing his wedding vows. "And in doing so, you gave me not just life, but a reason to truly live it." Preston bent to kiss her, pouring all his love and gratitude into the gesture. When they parted, he rested his forehead against hers, whispering the words that had become their private benediction. "Thank God for blizzards." Their laughter, warm and intimate, drifted up toward the star-filled Wyoming sky, the sound of 2 people who had found in each other not just love, but home.